Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Josh Broth. I'm from Sumo Logic, and today we're going to go over using Sumo Logic. This is some of the pre-work that will be involved in passing Level 2 certification and becoming a Sumo Power user. Today's call will be a combination of slides as well as some in-app demonstrations and demos. So let's go ahead and get started here. If you have any questions during the call, feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat, and I'll try and address them periodically. And then at the end, we'll have some time for Q&A as well. So what we're going to be discussing today, these are kind of the 5 things that we'll be going over regarding becoming a Sumo Power user. We'll certainly talk about learning how to use a unified log and metric solution. A lot of that was covered actually in Level 1, so we'll kind of just touch on that. Developing a tool set for basic and advanced analytics. So going through some of the tools that are going to help you develop these queries to really dig into your data and see what's going on. Making Sumo work for you, monitoring some trends and critical events. This is going to be helpful to understand, as it describes, monitoring those trends and critical events. And then we'll go over some pure use cases, and then certainly show you where to go from here. Today we're going to be going over some of the lab work that is involved in Level 2. So certainly I would encourage you to go through this tutorial on your own time. There's links on our website to this page and to get to the training environment. So I would certainly encourage you to do so. And of course, to go through the certification that we offer. This will be some of the Level 2 hands-on lab work. So reviewing some of the basics. Logs and metrics and how do they work together. If you've attended the previous webinar for Level 1, you saw a demonstration where we went through a fictitious environment called Troubleshooting Logic, and we showed you how logs and metrics are combined to work together. And I'm not going to go through the demo again today, but I do want to just recall some of those aspects of the demo. The first one that was shown in the demo was the alerts. So being able to be notified of a critical event. We don't want you sitting in Sumo Logic the whole time, 24/7. This is going to provide you the ability to be notified when you're outside Sumo Logic, so you can have an alert sent via Slack, an email notification, using the dashboard to go ahead and be notified of events as well. So in this simplistic view on the left-hand side of the screen, we can see green is good, red is bad, and that gives us an indication of what's going on. Once we get that, we can use our metrics to identify what's going on. So in the demo that was done previously, we looked at, we saw some checkout issues, and we were able to use the metrics to identify that there was some CPU spiking. And so that was helping us identify what was going on, which was, once again, that CPU spikes. And then we combined it with the logs to identify why it was happening. And if you recall in the demo, we went through and we did some querying. We used some log reduce, and we'll use some of those cool advanced analytic features today. But ultimately, we were able to determine, oh, that development code had been pushed to a production server, and that's why there was a problem. And so that's how we were able to use all 3 of those aspects in a, as we describe, a unified logs and metrics environment to go ahead and see what was going on, what was the cause, and more importantly, how to resolve it. Sumo Logic data flow. This slide may be familiar to you as well if you've attended a previous webinar, but it's an important one to understand so that you are aware of how data flow works and the 3 kind of components that exist within Sumo Logic. The first one is data collection. We're not going to go over data collection too much. That's really more of a Level 3 thing, but it's important to note that essentially data needs to be brought into Sumo Logic. Collectors will be essentially a piece of software or a method to bring that data into Sumo Logic, which of course we would encourage because you need to get that data into Sumo in one way or another. So once you have that data in Sumo Logic, then step 2 is going to be appropriate. If you now have that data sitting there, now you need to do something with it. And of course, you're going to want to start to search and analyze that data. And using operators, using queries, which we'll go over shortly, using some of the charts that are available, this is going to give you a good visual or a good way to look at your data and see exactly what's going on with it. And then visualizing and monitoring is that 3rd component. And I just referenced alerts and dashboards on the previous slide, but the importance here is now you have your data in Sumo, now you've kind of queried through it and culled through it, and now you need a way to visualize it. Dashboards are great as a tool to be able to, for you as at a glance to see what's going on, also for others as a glance. Certainly, you know, you could have a big screen in your NOC or your command center, And as I showed earlier with the panels, red bad, green good, it's very clear as to what those are. Even if you don't know the data very well, you can still get a feel for what's going on, and then alerts on top of that so that you can go ahead and be notified, and you don't have to sit looking at the dashboard 24/7. You can still be notified of those type of things that are taking place. Data collection. So this is referencing that first step of the data flow. Essentially, data needs to be brought into Sumo Logic. I'm not going to go over this slide too specifically. Level 3 will cover this in a little more detail as far as how the collectors act, the differences between them. As you can see on the top left, there's essentially 3 different types of collectors: cloud to cloud, centralized, and then local data. And those can all be used to bring your data into Sumo Logic. And that's really what I want to kind of point out in a nutshell at this step right now, is just that those different methods of bringing data exist. And as I said, that's more of a level 3 thing that we can certainly cover in the next webinar, which is actually scheduled for Thursday if you're interested in attending. And then finally, data collection metadata. So you have all this data that's brought into Sumo Logic. You're going to need a way to query through it. How are you going to do that? Using metadata tags, this is going to be a great way to go ahead and associate log messages with something. So these values are going to be set through the collector or source configuration. So as you see here, you may decide to use the label of collector to identify your data. In this case, with the example, it would be associated with your production US collected data. Maybe you use the source host, where you're going to specify the host name of the server. So you're actually specifying a specific server and going to query that way. Ultimately, what we would recommend is using the source category. And the reason being is this is going to be a freely configured metadata tag that you can apply. And this is also more of a level 3 thing of how these are associated and when they're created. But essentially, when your data is ingested, you can go ahead and apply these labels. And the cool thing about it is they can help identify your data at a glance, even if you don't really know what that data is doing. So for example, with this source category, prod Apache Access, even if you don't know what this data is, just by the naming convention, you can identify, oh, this is referring to production data. It's referring more specifically to Apache data. And more specifically, it's even referring to access Apache data that exists on production servers. These names are going to be, as it says, freely configured. And the naming conventions that we would recommend and how you do that, as mentioned, would be covered in level 3, and would certainly encourage you guys to join that call on Thursday. So searching and parsing. So now you have your data in Sumo Logic, and now you need to start to do something with it. You need to go ahead and start to essentially filter it. And let's go ahead and start to discuss how that works. One more slide, and then we'll get into the app. So what we're going to discuss now is the different ways to search and parse your data. We're going to start with searching and filtering your data. As mentioned, your data is in the system, and now you need to start to pull it out. And I'll go ahead and start to show some examples. And then we'll also talk about parsing fields to provide structure to your data. So you have this set of data in the system, and you want to go ahead and start to apply fields to this data. How do you do it? And I'll show you actually 3 or almost 4 different ways on how to do that. So let's go ahead and get started on that. So I'm going to go ahead and jump back into the application here. Where is here it is. Sorry about that. And so what I'm now looking at is the Sumo Logic app. If you haven't seen it before, this is the screen that you would be brought to when you first log in. There's going to be some information at the top that's going to be very helpful for you if you're new to, particularly if you're new to the system, on the Learn tab, which is where you can go ahead and listen to some of these webinars. So if you want to hear this call again later, this will be available for you. You also have access to things like the cheat sheets, documentation, a quick link to the community, and a bunch of tutorials that we would encourage you to go through on your own so that you can really get that hands-on experience within Sumo Logic. So let's go ahead and start to dive into queries. So I'm going to go ahead and go up here and go to a new and do a new log search. And hopefully you've seen this screen before. If you haven't, this is where you would start to do your query. So you're brought into a very basic screen with a query or a search bar at the very top, and you're going to go ahead and start to just enter data. And so let's go ahead and start with just a very basic example. So I'm going to go ahead and start to look, and I'm going to use a source category to identify my data. So I'm going to use the source category is equal to, And I'm going to specify that I want to look at my labs, Apache, access data. And actually, as I'm typing that, you'll see the search ahead is helping me. And so it's actually going to let me click on Apache access and save me a little bit of typing. And so when I go ahead and click start, what's going to happen now is a query is going to be run across this entire set of data. Now, at this point, I haven't narrowed down my query to say I'm looking only for these fields or this value. I'm simply saying, show me everything in Lab Apache Access. And so we see here there were, for the last 15 minutes, there were 55,000 results on about 2,200 pages of information there available to us. But now we can go ahead and start to take this query and modify it and use it to go ahead and identify what we're looking for and implement some keyword searching. So let's say I wanted to go ahead and I wanted to go look for 404 errors, for example. I can go ahead and type 404 and hit enter or start, and my query is going to run. And now, as you'll see here, the results are now down to 1,900, and we see the 404 is now highlighted throughout the results. When we're looking at the results, we're looking at, by default, we'll get two pieces of information. We're going to get the time of the message, and then the message itself, and then we see the message displayed here. You'll notice that, as I said earlier, the 404 is now being searched for and being identified. It's important to note that at this point, the 404 is only referencing a string of 404. We're not specifically looking at source codes of 404 or status codes, excuse me, of 404. It's just simply looking for those 3 digits, which is good. It's a good place to start, but as we'll go through this demo, we'll certainly get more specific in what we're identifying. Another way to go ahead and look through your data is to use the live tail. And I'll show this now, and I'll show it only once. It's not used that frequently, but it is a great way to see what data is being ingested essentially in real time. So if I go up to New and go to Live Tail, I'm now going to get a different type of search window. In this case, I can still go ahead and type my query. So I'm going to go ahead and do source category equals labs. And you'll notice the search ahead is not occurring for me at this point. And this is because this live tail is going to look at data as it is being ingested. And so none of the source categories, none of the labels have been essentially identified by the system, so you can't search upon them. But we can go ahead and search in this way. So let's say go ahead and search, click run. Now in real time, we're going to be seeing all the data that exists as it comes in for Labs Apache Access. And we can still go ahead and put our keywords in here. So let's say I want to go ahead and now I want to search for those 404s. Once again, it's just looking for the string of 404. And I click run. And now we see 404 here. And I'm going to pause this real fast because it's showing me actually something interesting that I want to just show to you guys. So we're seeing the 404 here, and these are the status codes. And so we see 404 here. It's also picking up 404 over here because in the time, there's 404 milliseconds for this time. So that's just something to be kind of cognizant of. But at this point, we are seeing this data in real time. And so we can go ahead and view this as it's running. We go jump to the bottom, and we're going to see this information scrolling by. In reality, this data is going to be coming back pretty quickly, assuming you're ingesting, potentially thousands or hundreds of thousands of messages even each minute. So while it's not going to be the most practical way to go through your data, it is a great way to take a look at a glance to see what's going in, making sure that your data is being ingested, and just get a feel for it. So I did want to point that out because I do think it's useful. But let's go back to the queries, because that's really where we're going to be doing the most work and where you're really going to get a feel for how to look through your data and pull out what's relevant to you. What I want to show now are, and actually let me go back to slides. So actually we're going to go over parsing right now, and let's go back in there. So what I want to discuss now is parsing, essentially how to go ahead and pull out your fields. So as I mentioned just a moment ago, when I was looking for these 404s, which are status codes, when I do this query in this manner, I'm simply looking for 404 wherever it exists. But let's say I want to go ahead and look for those status codes, because that's really what's important to me. So I want to start pulling information based on status codes. How am I going to go ahead and do that? I have a couple different ways, and I want to show you the ways that I can go ahead and do it. So the first way is I can go ahead and use regex. So let me see if I have an example up here. Actually, perfect, I do right here. So what I'm going to do with this example here, let me go ahead and just clean this up a tiny bit, is use regex to use the pattern matching to identify a IP address. And we're going to play with the IP addresses for a few moments. And so if I want to go ahead and identify all the IP addresses, one way to do so is using regex. And with regex, if you're not familiar with it, it's basically doing pattern matching. And it's essentially looking through, going to identify using this pattern. So it's going to look for essentially a digit, and it's going to look for a dot. So essentially looking for number, dot number, dot number, dot number. And when we find that, we're going to call that an IP address. And when we do, we're going to see that IP address displayed below. And so that's one way to go ahead and pull out those fields. Regex is a good way of doing it. It works perfectly fine. However, if you've dealt with regex in the past, you know it can be very finicky, very touchy, and we want to provide you some better tools to do so. So let me show you a couple alternatives on how to extract those fields. The second way we can extract those fields, with the regex being the first way, is using a parse anchor. And let me go ahead and just clean this up for a second, and I'll show you exactly how I'm going to do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this entire message here. And before I do so, one of the cool things about logs, or as cool as logs can be, is that they typically follow a standard format. And so a Apache log, for example, we're looking at Apache access logs, are always going to follow the same format. And if we look at them, we can see the format. Even if we don't truly understand the logs or how logging works, we can still get a feel for what's going on. We see an IP address. We see a date. More specifically, we see a year, month, date, time. We see URL information. We see that status code that I was referring to earlier, and so on and so forth. And so what I want to do is I want to start to make fields based on these. And how am I going to do that? One way is to use that regex as I described, but it can get a little tricky when we're starting to identify some fields within here. And that's, I want to show you how a better way to do it, and actually using the UI rather than going ahead and creating the command. So what I can do is I can highlight this whole message and then choose parse the selected text. And when I do, I'm going to get that message up here. And what I can do now is go ahead and start to label these pieces of text and essentially provide fields for them. So for example, we're going to take this section here, and we're going to go ahead and call that an IP. We could call it an IP address. We could call it an IP identification number. We can call it whatever we want. We should make sure that it's something that makes sense both to us and to anybody else that might use this query. So we should try and stick with a somewhat uniform naming convention, but the decision making is all up to you. Next, we're going to go ahead and we're going to separate these by commas, and we're going to go ahead and start to identify this portion of the message. Now, we could go ahead and say that this is a year, this is the day, this is the month, month, day, time. So this is the hour, minute, second, millisecond. But you know what? For my query, I don't really care about this. So I'm just going to take the whole thing. I'm just going to lump it together and call it timestamp, because I don't really need that information. If I did need to go ahead and eventually do a query based on year or month or day or what have you, then it would make more sense for me to kind of split those up into the appropriate segments. But for right now, you know, I don't really need that information. I'm going to keep going just a little bit more. So I'm going to grab this portion right here, and I'm going to go ahead and call that the refer. And I'm not really going to use that, so I'm just kind of giving these names. This is what I am going to use. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and I'm going to call that status code. And we'll be playing with the status codes a couple times throughout the call. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab that and call that the size. And then finally, actually two more. I'm going to grab this whole thing. And I'm going to call that URL. And then once again, I have this last section here. Now, this is representing the information about the browser, so essentially user agent information. And once again, I could go ahead and start to split this out, but well, I don't really care about it too much. I'm going to just take the whole thing, and I'm just going to call it user agent. And I'm going to go ahead and click submit. And now what's going to happen on my screen is I'm going to have this parse statement. And I'm going to use the same idea of pattern recognition in here to identify these fields. So essentially, I'm going to look at the first part of the message, and I'm going to call it IP. I'm going to look for a space. I'm going to look for a dash. I'm looking for a space. I'm looking for a dash, open bracket. And then what's in there, I'm going to call timestamp. So let's go ahead and run this to see what it actually looks like. And so now what I have is I have all these sections of the message. I still have my original message over here, but I now have these broken out. So now here are all my IPs, and here are my referrers, and here are my sizes and my status codes, et cetera, et cetera. And so I can start to go ahead and run results on these. So for example, let's say I wanted to go ahead now and I wanted to do a count by IP address. I can go ahead and do, or actually, yeah, let's start with that. So count by IP address. And now when I run this, I'm going to get my IPs over here and my counts over here, and I have a new column for aggregates. So if you have not seen this before, when you do essentially kind of anything on with the mathematics of your data, you're going to get a new tab called aggregates. And so we see that here. And so I was able to go ahead and identify what the IP address is and go ahead and actually provide it as a way to pull information. But let's keep going because there's more we can do here. So let's go ahead and go back to our messages. And actually, let's go ahead and start a new window because now I want to show you a third way to create fields. So far I showed you how to use regex to create fields or extract fields. I showed you how to use the parsing built into the UI, but let me show you another way. So I'm going to go ahead and just create a new log search. I'm going to go ahead and pull my same set of data. We're going to be using that Lab Apache Access data a few times today. So Labs Apache Access, and I'm going to hit enter. And now once again, we're kind of back to where we were earlier, where we have our time and our message. Now you'll notice, or you'll now notice because I'm pointing it out, on the left-hand side of the screen, we have some what we call hidden fields. And these are some fields that I had previously extracted using the parsing. And so we see IP address in here, we see status code, we see all those different fields that I was using earlier or alluding to earlier, and now I can go ahead and take advantage of these. And so let's say I want to go ahead and look only for status codes that are equal to 404. I can go ahead and click on this little guy here, and I'm going to be able to view all my status codes that are available to me. So here we see that there are 73% of the status codes available are 200s, and so on and so forth. And I can go ahead and click on my 404s. And now I'm looking at only my status codes that exist with 404. So how did I get these fields? In order to get them, somebody essentially did the hard work for me and set up what we call field extraction rules. And let's go ahead and take a look at those. What field extraction rules are the ability to go ahead and data upon ingestion will have this field created for them. So let's go ahead and look at settings, look at field extraction rules, and we see all these field extraction rules available. And so I can go ahead and look at one of these. Let's pick one. This is a demo test environment, so that's why there are so many different rules. But we can pick any of these. So I'm going to go ahead and grab one of these that Katie created. And so what she did is basically upon ingestion of any of these source categories, so Apache Access, this parsing is going to apply. And so once again, we see that pattern recognition in there. So we're essentially looking for the source IP, and we're looking for number.number.number.number.number. We're going to look for essentially a little bit of a space there, and then we're going to find the method, we're going to find the URL, we're going to find the status codes, and so on and so forth. So because somebody set these up already for me, I can go ahead and take advantage of them and use these status codes and all these fields in my queries without actually having to do the heavy lifting, essentially. The cool thing about those is they take place upon ingestion. So all you have to do is set this up, and as your data starts to come in, these rules will be applied, and you can go ahead and start to extract information based on these fields. So that's going to be a really helpful way to go ahead and also parse through your data. So let's go ahead and jump back into the slide deck just to kind of get to the same place on here. So we went through these couple of options already. And next, we're going to go over some simple analytics. So what are we talking about when we're talking about simple analytics? We're basically talking about these type of different filtering options. And let's look at a better example of how the filtering works, and more importantly, how your query syntax is going to work. The query syntax is going to be based upon keywords and operators that are going to be separated by pipes and built upon each other or on top of each other. And we see an example right down here. And so here's an example where we're starting to look at source category and look for the keyword Mozilla. And then we're starting to parse out our data using, in this case, using regex. So we're identifying the URL, we're identifying status code. And then next, we're going to start to filter that. So we're only going to look where status code, in this case, matches 5-star, which would be 5 anything. And we saw that earlier when I did where status code matches 404. But let's go ahead and look at some of the simple analytics, which is some of these, the aggregation you just saw for a second there. We did see the aggregates tab. We looked at the conditional filter, but let's go ahead and start to actually dig into these a little bit deeper and really start to play and see what they do. So let me go ahead and jump back into the example here. So I'm going to go ahead and actually pull up a example here. Let me see, do I have it saved already? Oh, here it is already, perfect. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and start to do some if with my query. So let's go ahead and comment these out first. What I'm doing with the backslash is putting a comment, which is essentially turning off these lines. And so I want to go ahead and show you what I want to demonstrate first. So let's go just click start. And so at this point, what we're pulling is we're pulling our lab Apache Access data, and we're looking for status codes. And we see that here. So we see here, we see our status codes, and we see our messages. But now we want to go ahead and start to use some of the analytics, and we're going to start to use the if. What we're going to do with the if statements is we're going to use this to look for and identify successes. And essentially, when we see a 200, we're going to mark that as a success. So let's go ahead and run this, and I'll talk through it as it's up there. So the example that we're looking at here is we want to go through our data, and if we see a 200, which is a successful status code, we want to mark that as a success, excuse me. And if we see a 404, we want to mark that as a client error. So what we're doing with this third line here is we're saying if we see a status code is equal to 200, mark that as a true for a success, essentially. So tally 1 for success. If you don't see a 200, mark that as a 0 for success. And we see that right here. So the first one we see status code is a 304. Is that a success? Nope. So that's why we see a 0. We see a 200. Is that a success? Yep. And that's why we see a 1. Keep going. We see a 302 down here. Is that a success? Nope. And that's why we see a 0. So now let's go ahead and build upon this and take this a little bit further. So now let's start to look for client errors, which are going to be those 404s. Let's go ahead and run this line. And so what we're looking for now is we're going to look at each line. We're going to pull out the status code. And if we see a 200, we're going to mark that as success. If we see a client error, which is a 404, we're going to mark that as a 1 over here. We see a 304. Is that a 200? Nope. Is that a 404? Nope. So that's why we see 0, 0. Next one's a 200. Is that a success? Yep. Is it a client error? Nope. 0, 1. Now let's see if we can find a 404 just to show you the other one real quickly. Okay, cool. Perfect. There's one. So here we see a 404. Is that considered a success? Nope. That's why we see a 0. Is it considered a client error? Yep. And that's why we see a 1. And so what we can do is now we can take this essentially tallying that we've done and do a summation. And so what we're doing with this last line is we're doing essentially a sum of our successes, which is take all the success counts and add them up. And then we're going to take all our client errors, create a sum, and call that client error count. And now we're going to run this. And now what we're presented is our aggregate tab. And so we see there were about 43,000 successes and about 2,000 client errors. And so this is a way that we can go ahead and start to take our more advanced filtering options and help create queries that are going to be useful to identify what's going on. So rather than just doing a count of 200s, we can start to label them as successes or as client errors. And so that's going to be a good kind of jumping off point if you haven't seen this before on how to go ahead and start to use some of the simple analytics that exist within the system. Let's go ahead and jump back to the slides, and we're going to start to actually get into some more advanced analytics. Let's go ahead and so with the advanced analytics, we're going to start to look at outliers, trends, needles in a haystack, as we say. And so let's go ahead and look at a couple of these. And I'm actually going to bring these up on the screen. So these are the queries that we'll be using, but let's actually view them in app. So let me go ahead and jump in here. And let me go ahead. I should have some examples over here. And let's go ahead and look at identifying outliers to start with. So what outliers are going to be useful for is to alert you when things are outside of the norm. If you had attended, I keep alluding to the demo that we did for level 1, but part of the demo that was done was we were looking at some gateway latency. And we established a baseline, and we were able to see that baseline. And then we were able to see as things went above or below that baseline and essentially be notified of those alerts. And so let's look at that in the application. So let's go ahead and just run this, and then I'll explain what we're looking at. So what I've run is I'm looking for my source category of Lab Apache Access. In this case, I'm just looking for status code of 200, so just keep that in mind. I'm doing what's called a time slice, which is basically I'm taking my data of the last 60 minutes and I'm slicing it into values that are broken out into minute chunks. Let me just go ahead and zoom in here a little bit. One more. Okay, cool. So now we're able to see these time slices. So we see 834, 835, and what we're looking at essentially are tallies. So we see that during 834, there were 3,600, 200 status codes. 835, we see 2,800. And what we're doing with the outlier is we're starting to develop an upper and a lower limit for these numbers. So we're basically using the mathematics that exists within this query, and we're basically saying, okay, this is going to be the baseline for this set of data. Now, in this view, looking at this aggregates tabular view, I can kind of see what's going on, but to be perfectly honest, not really. I mean, I can kind of get a visual picture, but it's not clear to me. So what I can do is I can switch to one of the graphing options with the line chart and get a much better representation of what's taking place. And so what we see here is the dark blue line is representing the status code count. So in this case, the amount of 200s that occur during each minute chunk. And then we see the light blue is representing that threshold. So essentially that upper and lower limit based on, as I mentioned earlier, kind of mathematics that are taking place. And then what we see is, so we see here, for example, there were 3,300 status codes of 200. The threshold was determined to be between 1,500 and about 4,900. And so we're within that threshold. So good or bad, but we're still within that threshold. What we see down here is we see that the threshold was determined to be between 2,100 and 4,500. However, in this case, there are 2,000 status codes. So in this case, this falls outside the threshold. And so what we see here is a pink triangle representing that value is outside the threshold. So with 200s, these are okay. But what I want to do is I want to look at I want to look at 404s. So I'm just going to change the status codes instead. This time I'm going to look at 404s. And so I'm just going to expand my search out just because I want to illustrate this, and hopefully the data will, yeah, there we go, perfect. So what I'm looking at now is I'm looking at 404s. In this case, I've just extended my query out 3 hours, but we still see, the peaks and valleys and the thresholds. But what we see with the 404s here is, for example, right here, we were expecting approximately between 58 and 185 404 errors, but in this case, we see 227, which is not a good sign, that 404s are bad, and this is exceeding the amount of 404s that we're expecting, which could be a bad thing. Conversely, we see over here, we were expecting between 90 and 185 404s, and there were only 82, which in some people's view is a good thing. And so let's say I don't want to see when it was under. In this case, like I said, I consider this to be good. And so it's not, in my mind, while it is an outlier, it's nothing that I want to be notified on. What I can do is I can go up here to the outlier syntax, essentially, and adjust it. One of the fields, or portions of it, rather, it's not really a field, is direction. And what I'm looking at here is I'm essentially saying, look for outliers that exist above and below, or plus and minus, above and below the threshold, and identify them. But as I just mentioned, the outliers that exist below, that's not really important to me. So I just want to see when 404s exceed the threshold. All I need to do is just remove the minus symbol. And now I'm just going to be looking for a plus. And then when I click start, those two should fall out. And they do. And now I'm just finding the outlier that exists that is above the threshold. And so this can be a useful way to go ahead and start to view those things. Let's go ahead and take a look at another advanced analytics. And I should mention, and I haven't really pointed to the documentation yet, but all these fields and values are going to be available in the documentation to see exactly how they work. So for example, if you look in the documentation, and actually I can pull it up real fast, and to do so, I'm just going to actually do a quick Google search. I'm going to do Sumo Logic outlier. And I'm going to see in the outlier documentation, and I'm going to see these are those 4 different parameters that I was identifying earlier. So direction, I just showed you how it works. Threshold, for example, is using your standard deviations. So maybe you create a query and you decide, this is too tight or too wide of a threshold, and you want to modify it. You can go ahead and do so. And so maybe instead of using 3 standard deviations, I want to use 5, and I can go ahead and do that. And now my results, as a result of my results, are going to be the scale is going to be different because I'm using different standard deviations. So let's go ahead and look at the next one we're going to look at is predict. And let me go ahead. I should have it up here. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and start to run this. And as you might predict, the predict operator is going to allow you to help identify future trends. And so we can use things to predict the load of your servers based on past activity, for example. Let's go ahead and run this one, though. This is going to be based on requests. So let's go ahead and start this. And so once again, we get put into this tabular view. In this case, we're looking at time slices by 5 minutes. So we're looking at our requests based on 5-minute chunks. So we see 6:35, 6:40, 6:45, et cetera. And let's go ahead and run this right now. So I'm going to click start. And let's go ahead and switch to the line view. And so what I'm seeing now is both the requests that have occurred based on this light blue, which is the actual count of requests during the 5-minute chunk, and the requests as predicted using, as you saw on that previous screen and identified over here, using that kind of advanced analytics mathematical stuff to decide what is going to be the prediction for the future. So right now it is, what time is it? It's 9:40 on the West Coast. So we see here, the last time we saw our requests were right about here, but as we see from the prediction, they are trending upward. And so this is the prediction, and certainly it will be interesting to see over the next half hour or so, does it stick true to the prediction? But the prediction is showing an upward trend. So that's going to be a good way to go ahead and use the analytics to take into account what's previously happened and what may occur in the future. Let's go ahead and look at another advanced analytics. This one's going to be a little bit different. So let me go ahead and let me create a query here. Actually, I can use one of the examples. So let's go ahead and look at log reduce first. So what I'm looking at right now, let me start this up, is we're going to look at some security data. And so what we're looking at is snort data, which is security data. And as we see here, we're looking for, actually, I'm going to expand this out to the last hour just to get some more data in here. And so what we're looking at through this data is, and even if you don't know what this data is, you can kind of see what's going on here. But we see, for example, here there was a classification of a web app attack. Here we see attempted information leak. So we see different types of security events that are taking place. And so over the last 60 minutes, we've had 6,000 of them and 244 pages of data. So I could start to go ahead and look through these and see, okay, what's happened, and look at all 244 pages and see, what's going on. But this isn't a very efficient use of your time or an efficient use of a system that you have a bunch of great data in. So what we can use is what we call log reduce. And when I click log reduce, what it's going to do is it's going to essentially cut through the noise and help identify those things that are unique, like a network, a new attack on our network. So it's essentially doing some pattern recognition. And so it's saying, okay, over the last 60 minutes, I found 3,000 of these attempted information leaks. And I found 632 sensitive data classifications and so on and so forth. And so in a nutshell, I can get a glance to see information about this network intrusion that's taking place. And it gives me kind of a nice summary without having to do essentially the heavy lifting. Just by clicking that log reduce, it's doing that pattern recognition, and it's putting it all in here for me. And if you remember from the demonstration that was done in level 1, we used this to go ahead and essentially look for that kind of needle in the haystack to identify what was taking place. And that was how we were able to identify that development code was being loaded on their production server. We can also go ahead and use log compare at this point. So we've now done a log reduce, and we see these different events that have taken place in the last 60 minutes. But what if we want to go ahead and compare this to a previous time period? This is where log compare is going to come in, and it's going to help identify activity now to some period in the past and help measure change. So let's go ahead and run it and see what it looks like. So I'm going to click on log compare. And what we're doing now is we're essentially doing what is considered a time shift for 24 hours ago. So we're looking at data for the last 60 minutes. So we're looking from 8:43 Pacific time to 9:43 Pacific time. And then we're also going back yesterday and looking at data from 8:43 to 9:43. And we're looking essentially for the differences. So for example, here, the very first one, we see that there were, pretty much about the same amount, and the percentage change is an indication of how many more or less occurrences there were. But we see, 0.35, so it's basically the same amount as yesterday. We see here, a few less classification of sensitive data. But then if we keep going, okay, over here we see that there's been an increase of more than 100% of classifications of a virus outbound. A suspicious file name was detected. Well, that's interesting. Why is there a difference? Is there now some sort of a new virus that's trying to attack us, or what have you? In this case, with this set of data, it's kind of a good thing because these are being detected. So it does appear that the system was properly blocking these, but it is a great way to go ahead and look at things over time. And so we can go ahead and compare those two different time periods. And we could change this. So maybe instead of looking at the last 24 hours, we want to look at between today and 72 hours ago, which would be Saturday. And so we can go ahead and do that same time shift as well. Let's go ahead and jump back into the slides just to kind of reset. So let's, where are my slides? So we talked about outlier, we talked about predict. We discussed log reduce, which is, as it says here, finding that needle in the haystack by identifying those patterns, using log compare to go ahead and then also take those patterns and compare them with patterns in the past. And all these components, I should mention, if you haven't either seen this webinar before or haven't gone through level 2, all these will have lab components that we would encourage you to go through on your own, where you can actually go ahead and create your own outliers and get the hands-on experience, which is going to be more valuable than me just reading these to you. But we certainly encourage you to do so. Let's go ahead and talk about analyzing metrics briefly. We've looked at logs. And so logs are a great source of data for you to see what's going on, but we can also go ahead and look at the metrics. And so you have the ability to ingest metrics from 3 different sources. You can identify, ingest your host metrics. You can ingest metrics that exist in AWS, or if they're graphite compatible, those can be brought in as well. And so we would certainly encourage you to bring in those metrics. When you do, you have the ability to use some of the metrics apps. And so the apps, as shown in level 1, allow you to essentially use those predefined queries and go ahead and take advantage of them with searches and dashboards that are going to be created for you. The idea being with the app catalog and the apps themselves is that, as mentioned with logs, they follow a pattern. And so we can recognize that pattern, and we can help overlay queries and dashboards for you that you can take advantage of. And essentially all you need to do is just tell us where those metrics exist, or more importantly, the source category or the identification for those metrics when they're in Sumo Logic, and then go ahead and overlay the dashboards with them. And here's an overlay, for example, that combines logs and metrics. So what you can do here is you can have your metrics overlay with their relevant logs, and at the same time of looking at your metrics to identify what, you can use your logs to help identify why, and use them together to ultimately figure out, what was going on with the system, and more importantly, resolve it or provide that content that you were looking for. Let's see. Monitoring your data. Let's go ahead and jump into dashboards and some other monitoring capabilities. So let's go ahead and jump back into the query. And let's go ahead and take a look. Do I have any handy dashboards up here? So what I'm looking at is my library, and I'm going to go ahead and just pull up some dashboards. So let's look at Apache. Let's grab the Apache overview here. So what I've done is I've pulled up a dashboard that I previously created. And so now I'm viewing this dashboard, and I want to go over basically the components of it, and I'll also show you how to create your own, which is going to be just as important. So in this case, I have access to this dashboard. And what the dashboard is essentially just panels that are taking your results and have the queries on the back end. And so let's go ahead and look at, for example, visitor locations. If I click on this little button here, it's going to show me in search. And what I'm looking at now is the query that I used to create that panel, the dashboard. And so here's my query. And without getting too detailed in it, I see I'm looking for an IP, and I'm looking for other pieces of information in there. In this case, I'm looking just at United States data. So I'm specifying I just want to see this graphical data or this map data for the US. And so I now have this dashboard handy, or this panel handy. But let's go back to one that we used earlier and create a new panel and actually create a new dashboard. So let's go ahead and grab, let's see. Oh, I don't know. It doesn't really matter. Let's use the outlier one. So what we have here is we've created this query. We're looking at our 404s. When we have this panel right here, and we want to be able to present this to other people. And more importantly, we want to be able to present it via a dashboard. So how do we do it? Well, simply we click Add to Dashboard. When we do, we're adding this panel to either an existing dashboard or a new one. I'm going to create a new dashboard just for illustrative purposes. I'm going to call this dashboard, I'm going to use my initials, JB Apache. And I'm going to click Create New. I'm going to decide where to save it. So I have my folder structure that allows me to save wherever I want. I'm just going to click Add. And now, I have a new dashboard that I've created. And so here I have my panel. And I have, well, nothing else at this point. So I can start to now play with this dashboard and adjust it. So maybe I want to go ahead and expand this out, make this a little bigger. I can go ahead and do so. Maybe I want to go ahead and add a new panel. So let me go ahead and click on this, add a panel, and maybe I want to add a panel of text and call it Apache Info. And I can go ahead and do so. And I can, once I'm done, I can go ahead and click on Done Editing. And then I have a few options up here. The first one I want to show you is the Share option. So you've created this dashboard. You're proud of it. It's information that's going to be valuable to you. But you know what? It might be valuable to somebody else, and you want to share it with an individual. Just go ahead and click on this little icon up here. And you're going to have a bunch of different options on how you share it, who has access, what type of access they have. We have a whole RBAC options as far as role-based access controls, covered a little more in level 3, but you can go ahead and kind of get a feel for those here. So maybe I want to share this out to only the analysts in my organization, and I want them to be able to edit the dashboard. I can go ahead and do so. Maybe I want to share this with Bob, or let's see, Bob doesn't exist in here. Let's go ahead and share it with Caleb, and I want him to be able to go ahead and edit it as well. I have those controls. The other option I have in here, which is kind of cool, is I can provide a shareable URL to somebody. So I can go ahead and just give them this URL, and they can go ahead and look at the dashboard. Based on this option here, you can decide whether or not you are going to make this dashboard accessible outside your organization. So you can go ahead and say, I want to give this dashboard or have this dashboard accessible by anybody. And so you can go ahead and provide anybody with this URL. And as it says here, anybody outside your organization with this link can access this dashboard in live mode. And so what you could do is you could provide this to a customer or a client or just somebody that doesn't have access to Sumo Logic. And so as mentioned earlier with the red, bad, green, good view, even if they don't know what's going on with data, they can still look at the dashboard, still get a feel for what's going on. And even if they didn't know how to create that complex query, they still can, as I just mentioned, get a feel for what's going on. So dashboards are going to be really helpful in that type of setting up. Let's go ahead and go back to identifying outliers and go back to this query. And I want to show you a couple other options you have in here regarding sharing and things like that. So when I go ahead and click on this save, there we go. I have the ability to, save this out. The saving is nothing new, but scheduling the search is. And so let's go ahead and show you these options with schedule the search. So what I can do is I can have this scheduled search run periodically. So maybe I want it to run every 15 minutes. And then I can go ahead and be notified periodically. So maybe I want this to run every 15 minutes, and every time the search is complete, I want to be notified. And I can choose those notification options. So maybe I want to be notified by email. I want to get an email of this data because I do. Maybe I want to go ahead and be notified via some other options. So maybe I want a script to run using the script action. Maybe you're using ServiceNow and you want to have that connection there. Or webhook, where you can go ahead and set up a webhook. So as we saw with the demo previously, you can go ahead and be notified by Slack. You could have a Twitter notification set out. Any application that uses webhooks can go ahead and use that here and be notified. So that's going to be an option for you as well. Let me go ahead and just go back to email though. With the email option, you have a bunch of options here as well. So options upon options. So with the email, who do you want to be notified when this search runs? You can go ahead and choose your recipients. With the email subject, you can go ahead and use the variables in the subject line to essentially help describe what's going on. So maybe you want to go ahead and it actually defaults with the search name, but maybe you want to put the alert condition so that the person who receives it essentially knows what's going on or why they got this email just by looking at the subject line. Also, you're going to decide what type of content do you want to include, in this case, in the email. So maybe you want to include the search query. Maybe you want to include that histogram, which is that middle panel over here. Maybe you want to include the results and attach them as a CSV. So a variety of different options there as far as taking that data and providing it to other people outside the organization. The other option that I'm going to point out here, which is going to be very important, is this send notification. So I've been talking about having this data or this email essentially get sent out every 15 minutes, which would be each time the search is complete. But maybe you want to have it occur only when a condition is met. So maybe you want to go ahead and specify here, specifically since we're talking about outliers, you only want to be notified when the outliers are equal to or essentially greater than 0. And so you could be notified that something has occurred outside the norm, and now you're going to be notified of it. And so rather than just getting that email every 15 minutes, you could be notified more specifically when something occurs. And so that's going to be a really good way to go ahead and essentially shut down some of the noise, so to speak. So rather than getting that notification, like I said, every 15 minutes, you would get it less frequently. And so you could go ahead and do that. If we want to set that here, we would go ahead and say that we want to be notified when the following condition is greater than 0, for example. And so if there's no outliers, you would not be notified. And when the following condition is met, which is going to be greater than 0, which would be essentially one outlier, then you would be notified. So that's going to be a good way to, like I said, kind of cut down on the noise of those notifications and those alerts. Let's go ahead and cancel out of that. Let's see, let's go jump back into the slides just to make sure we're still on track. So we discussed monitoring your data, visualizing your data, so charting that data, creating panels, publishing it. We discussed receiving notifications, so we did that portion. Let's see, use cases. So these are going to be some how-to templates to implement in your environment, basically taking some of the queries that we looked at and providing just some more context on them. So for example, let's say you want to go ahead and look at how to create an alert on ratio percentages. So let's go ahead and do some of these right now. So let's jump back in here. And let's see, do I already have that example created? I hope I do. Training. Perfect. So this is going to be, so once again, this is an outlier. What we're doing with this, and let's go ahead and let me talk through it just for a second before I go ahead and run it. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at Lab Apache Access data. And in this case, we're just looking for status codes that equal 200 or 404. So we're specifying only those. We're going to do that time slice again, so we're only looking at those 1-minute chunks. What we're doing here is instead of using the equals, we're using matches. So we're essentially saying if the status code matches 2, count that as a success. Now in this case, the only 2s would be 200s, so we could go ahead and just do something like that. But I'm going to leave the query as is. And then so we're essentially saying if we see a 200, count that as a success. If we see a 400 or a 4, count that as a fail. So let's go ahead and run that. I'm just going to use that comment to turn off these other lines just so I can get to the first portion of this query and show you what's going on with it. So now that it's run, we see our time slices. So we see our minute chunks, and we see our successes and our fails. So we see successes and our fails. Now, looking at successes and fails independent of one another, or even together, is not going to be that useful. If I tell you that there were 3,000 successful connections, or 200s in a minute period, or a 5-minute period, or any period of time, that number probably doesn't mean much to you. Is that good or is it bad? I don't know. Same thing with fails. You know, there were 150 fails. Is that good? Not great, but I don't know if it's that bad. So what I can do is I can go ahead and take these and do create essentially a failure rate by just doing essentially a ratio. So I'm going to take my fail count, I'm going to divide it by my success count, and it's going to give me a failure rate. And so now I can go ahead and see, all right, this is my failure rate. And so this is starting to, give me a little better indication of good versus bad. But now I can go ahead and start to use my outlier here. So I'm going to go ahead and sort these first. So I'm going to put these in time slice descending order. So now we have 958, 957 going backwards. I'm going to go ahead and slap those outliers on here. And so now I am viewing this outlier information, which in this view is a lot. There's a lot going on. But basically, I see my success count, I see my fail count, I get a failure rate. And then using the outlier, I'm starting to determine a threshold. So I'm saying this is the threshold, and this is the failure rate. And so let's go ahead and look at this in this view over here. And now since it's a ratio, the view's a little wacky. Let's see. Actually, I'm just going to leave it as for right now. But basically, if we look at these, we see as we saw earlier. So we see a threshold, we see a failure rate for that minute chunk, and then we see the pink representing an outlier. But where we can go ahead and start to use this for alerting is we can put this one in here. So we want to be notified where the failure rate, essentially this violation, is greater than 0. So what we could do is now we would be notified when this occurred. So at 9:07, 9:16, and so on and so forth in our when we go ahead and save this. So when we do save as and schedule the search, we would go ahead and specify here that the condition, which is that failure rate violation, is greater than 0, and then we would be notified that that event took place. And so that's an example of using outlier and then using the ratio to help identify what's good, what's bad by providing some numerical context to it, and then ultimately being notified on that. Cool. So let's see. So that's really what I wanted to cover. We're up about an hour, so if there's any questions, feel free to go ahead and type those into the chat as you guys have been doing. Where do you go from here? So we just provided you with some hopefully new knowledge. What do you do with it? How do you get some more help? Like I said, where do you go from here? Going to the Learn tab, as I identified at the beginning of the call, is going to be a great way for you to learn more. So you can go ahead and explore the tutorials. You can reference those technical documentations. You can go ahead and join the community, which we would encourage you to do. The community is going to be a great place for you to go in, ask questions of other members of the community, which are going to be other users of Sumo, and get a feel for how they're using it and kind of collaborate. It's going to be moderated by Sumo, so it's not a free-for-all, but it is a great place for you to interact with other organizations that may be using Sumo Logic. And then the next step here is really, I would encourage you guys to take the level 2 certification power user exam. So the content that we went over here is certainly a great base for that exam. As it says here, actually this webinar is part of the prep. The other portion of preparation for the exam would be the hands-on labs, which is essentially going to be taking some of the examples I was doing and doing them yourselves. There's more examples, so you're going to get a good experience on how to use Sumo Logic. And so I would encourage you certainly to go ahead and do those, and then take the exam on your, when you have time. It's an online exam consisting of 30 multiple choice questions, 90-minute time limit. It's free. It's free for you. It's free for your organization. It's just a great way to prove that you know what you're doing within the Sumo Logic environment, sharpen your skills. Also, you kind of walk away with a certificate that says, now I'm a Sumo Logic power user, and Sumo Logic is becoming more and more popular, and so you can go ahead and put that on your LinkedIn and show that you've learned a new skill. So, any other questions at this point? I'll go ahead and leave the channel open just for a moment or two. Okay, it doesn't look like there's any questions. Oh, so there's a question about subqueries. So let's go ahead and, let me go ahead and, so yes, there is. Oh, I'm sorry, let me read the question. So is there a way to write a subquery that filters results using a field from an initial search and query? So yeah, and actually let me pull up the example here. Let's see, did I paste it in? Let's see. Here's one. So, okay, so let's go through an example of, let me show you a set of data we're looking at and then show you how the query is going to work. And so it's going to be very, very simple to do. And so in this query, what we're looking at is we're looking at GitHub information. And so more specifically, we're looking at the committer that applied information to GitHub. So this is an individual that went in and committed code to GitHub. And so in here, we see, for example, we see the name of the user, we see the email, we see a bunch of information about the user. What we can do is we can go ahead and parse this information out. So what we're going to do first is we're going to parse the email field out. So we're going to say, use the pattern recognition or the regex to say, essentially look for email address. And let's go ahead and do that right now. And so now we have our email addresses here. But let's say we want to go ahead and parse this out even further. We want to take this email field that we created and parse it out based on user and domain. So essentially, the beginning portion of the email address will be the user. The last portion of the email will be the domain. In this third line, we're going to do exactly that. So we're basically saying here, take the field of email that we just created or defined above, and then use this pattern recognition to go ahead and take that and split it up even further. So take that field of email, which we know is going to represent or be represented by this pattern, and take before the @ call that user, take after the @ call that domain, and now you can go ahead and take those fields and go further. So for example, now we have first we had our email addresses, now we have our users and domains, and we can go further. Now we can say where the domain matches Sumo Logic. And so let's see, is there any content in there? Cool. So now we're looking at just those messages where the committer matched the domain of Sumo Logic. And we can even take it further where we can use the count of the user. So we're taking the two fields that we extracted from email, user and domain, and we're actually using them in two different methods here. We're using a matches here, and then we're going ahead over here and we're doing a count by users. And so that's one example of how we're able to go ahead and take our essentially our initial query and go ahead and filter it down into, or break it down into two different components, user and domain, and then we can take our query and start to dig deeper and go ahead in there. Let's see, another question. Is it possible for us to have access to the training folder queries? Absolutely. So if you go into the lab environment that is going to be part of the certification, or you can just do the labs on your own. When you go into the lab environment, you're actually going to have basically access to this. I have a little bit greater access just because I'm an instructor, but you'll still have access to this. So in order to do so, when you log in, you'll want to go into the library. Actually, it might even show up under personal for you, under training, and you should have access to these queries over here. So we would certainly recommend that you go ahead and look at them in there. Yeah, so that would be something that would be a great way for you to learn. So yes, you should have access to these when you use the login data provided within the lab environment. Any other questions at this point? All right, very good. Then we'll go ahead and conclude today's call. There is going to be a call on Thursday where we're going to go over level 3, which will go over some of the basics of setting up Sumo Logic as far as source categories, different elements of the collector as far as the differences between them, setting up users, things like that. Basically, a lot of stuff that's going to be under the administration tab. So I look forward to you guys joining on Thursday, and thank you for attending today.